Swann's Way, Combray II, Part 6, by Marcel Proust. While I was reading in the garden, a thing my great-aunt would never have understood my doing, save on a Sunday, that being the day on which it was forbidden to indulge in any serious occupation, and on which she herself would lay aside her sewing, on a weekday she would have said, "How can you go on amusing yourself with a book? It isn't Sunday, you know," putting into the word amusing an implication of childishness and a waste of time. My Aunt Léonie would be gossiping with Françoise until it was time for Eulalie to arrive. She would tell her that she had just seen Madame Goupil go by without an umbrella in the silk dress she had had made for her. If she has far to go before Vespers, she may get it properly soaked. Maybe, which also meant maybe not, was the answer, for Françoise did not wish definitely to exclude the possibility of a happier alternative. "There now," my aunt said, beating her brow. "That reminds me that I never heard if she got to church this morning before the elevation. I must remember to ask Eulalie. Françoise, just look at that black cloud behind the steeple, and how poor the sunlight is on the slates. You may be certain it will rain before the day is out. It couldn't possibly keep on like this. It's been too hot. And the sooner the better, for until the storm breaks, my Vichy water won't go down." She concluded, since in her mind the desire to accelerate the digestion of her Vichy water was of infinitely greater importance than her fear of seeing Madame Goupil's new dress ruined. Maybe. And you know that when it rains in the square, there's not much shelter." Suddenly, my aunt turned pale. "What? 3 o'clock?" she exclaimed. "But Vesters will have begun already, and I've forgotten my pepsin. Now I know why that Vichy water has been lying on my stomach." And grabbing hold of a prayer book bound in purple velvet with gilt clasps, out of which in her haste she let fall a shower of little pictures, each in a lace fringe of yellowish paper, which she used to mark the places of the greater feasts of the saints of the church, my aunt, while she swallowed her drops, began at full speed to mutter the words of the sacred text, its meaning being slightly clouded in her brain by the uncertainty whether the pepsin, which, taken so long after the Vichy, would still be able to overtake it and to send it down. 3 o'clock! It's incredible how time flies. A little tap at the window, as though something had struck it, followed by a plentiful, falling sound, as light as if a shower of sand were being dropped from a window overhead. Then the fall spreading, taking on an order, a rhythm, becoming liquid, loud, musical, innumerable, universal. It was the rain. "There, Françoise, what did I tell you? How it's coming down. But I think I heard the bell at the garden gate. Go along and see who can be outside in this weather." Françoise went and returned. "It's Madame Amédée." My grandmother. "She said she was going for a walk. It's raining hard all the same." "I'm not surprised," said my aunt, looking up toward the sky. "I've always said that she was not in the least like other people. Well, I'm glad it's she and not myself who's outside in all this." "Madame D is always the exact opposite of the rest," said Françoise, who, not unkindly, refraining until she was alone with the other servants from stating her belief that my grandmother was a bit off her head. "The benediction is over. Eulalie will never come now," sighed my aunt. "It will be the weather that's frightened her away." "But it's not 5 o'clock yet, Madame Octave. It's only 4:30. "Only 4:30, and here I am, obliged to draw back the small curtains just to get a miserable streak of daylight, at 4:30, only a week before the rogation days. Ah, my poor Françoise, the good Lord must be sorely vexed with us. The world is going too far these days. As my poor Octave used to say, we have forgotten the good Lord too often, and he is taking his vengeance on us." A bright flush animated my aunt's cheeks. It was Eulalie. As ill luck would have it, scarcely had she been admitted when Françoise reappeared, and with a smile that was meant to indicate her full participation in the pleasure which she had no doubt her tidings would give my aunt. Articulating each syllable so as to show that, in spite of her having to translate them into indirect speech, she was repeating, as a good servant should, the very words that the new visitor had condescended to use. And she said, "His Reverence, the Curé, would be delighted and enchanted if Madame Octave is not resting just now and could see him. His Reverence does not wish to disturb Madame Octave. His Reverence is downstairs. I told him to go into the parlor." Had the truth been known, the curé's visits did not please my aunt nearly as much as Françoise supposed. The air of jubilation with which she felt bound to illuminate her face whenever she had to announce his arrival did not altogether correspond to what was felt by her invalid. The curé, an excellent man with whom I am now sorry I did not converse more often, for even if he cared nothing for the arts, he knew a great many etymologies. Being in the habit of being distinguished and giving distinguished visitors information about the church, he had even planned to compile a history of the parish of Combray. Used to weary my aunt with his endless explanations, which, incidentally, never varied in the least degree. But when his visit coincided exactly with Eulalie's, his presence became frankly distasteful to my aunt. She would have preferred to make the most of Eulalie and not to have everyone at the same time. But she dared not send the curé away, and had to content herself with making a sign to Eulalie not to leave when he did, so that she might have her to herself for a little after he was gone. "What is this I've been hearing, Father? That an artist has set up easel in your church, and is copying one of the windows? Old as I am, I can safely say that I have never even heard of such a thing in all my life. What is this world coming to next, I wonder? And the ugliest thing in the whole church, too." "I will not go so far as to say that it is quite the ugliest, madame, for although there are certain things in Saint-Hilaire that are well worth a visit, there are others that are very old now. In my poor basilica, the only one in all the diocese that has never been restored. God knows our porch is dirty and out of date. Still, it is of a majestic character. The same can be said of the Esther tapestries, though personally I would not give 2 sous for them. But experts put them next to the ones after Sens. I can quite see, too, that apart from certain details that are a trifle realistic, they show others that testify to a genuine power of observation. But don't talk to me about the windows. It is common sense, is it, to leave up windows that shut out all the daylight and even confuse the eye by throwing patches of color that I wouldn't know how to describe on a floor in which there are not 2 slabs on the same level? And yet they refuse to renew the floor for me, on the pretext that those slabs are the tombstones of the abbots of Combray and the lords of Guermantes, and the old counts of Brabant, direct ancestors of the present Duc de Guermantes, and of his duchess also, since she was a Mademoiselle de Guermantes who married her cousin. My grandmother, by dint of refusing to take any interest in persons, had ended in confusing all their names and titles, and whenever anyone mentioned the Duchesse de Guermantes, she used to make out that she must be related to Madame de Villeparisis. The whole family would then burst out laughing, and she would attempt to justify herself by harking back to some invitation to a christening or funeral. I feel sure that there was a Guermantes in there somewhere. And for once I would side with the others and against her, refusing to admit that there could be any connection between her boarding school friend and the descendant of Geneviève de Brabant. "Look at Roussainville," the curé went on. "It is nothing more nowadays than a parish of farmers, though in olden times that locality must have had a considerable importance from its trade in felt hats and clocks. I am not certain of the etymology of Roussainville, though I would dearly like to think that the name was originally Rouville, from Radulfi Villa, analogous to Châteauroux, Castrum Radulfi. But We will talk about that some other time. Very well. The church there has superb windows, almost all quite modern, including the most imposing entry of Louis Philippe into Combray, which would be more in keeping surely at Combray itself, and which is every bit as good, I understand, as the famous window at Chartres. Only yesterday I met Dr. Pessier's brother, who knew all about those things, and he told me that he looked on it as a most beautiful piece of work. But as I said to this artist, who, by the way, seems to be a most civil fellow, and is, it appears, a true virtuoso with his brush, what on earth do you find so extraordinary in this window, which is, if anything, a little darker than the rest? I am sure if you were to ask the bishop, said my aunt in a resigned tone, for she had begun to feel that she was going to be tired, he would not refuse you a new window. You may depend on it, Madame Octave, replied the curé. Why, it was just his lordship himself who started the outcry about this wretched window, by proving that it represented Gilbert the Bad, a lord of Guermantes, and a direct descendant of Geneviève de Bourbon, who was a daughter of the house of Guermantes, receiving absolution from Saint Hilaire. But I don't see what Saint Hilaire comes in. Why, yes. Have you never noticed in the corner of the window a lady in a yellow robe? Very well. That is Saint Hilaire, who is also known, you will remember, in certain provinces as Saint Hilaire, Saint Hélier, and even in the Jura, Saint Élie. But these various corruptions of Sanctus Hilarius are by no means the most curious that have happened in the names of the blessed. Take, for example, my good Eulalie, the case of your own patron, Sancta Eulalia. Do you know that what she has become in Burgundy? Saint Éloi, nothing more nor less. The lady has become a gentleman. Do you hear that, Eulalie? After you are dead, they will make a man of you. Father will always have his joke. Gilbert's brother, Charles the Samur, was a pious prince, but, having early in life lost his father, Pepin the Mad, who died as a result of his mental infirmity, he wielded the supreme power with all the arrogance of a man who has not yet been subjected to discipline in his youth, so much so that whenever he saw a man in town whose face he did not like, he would have everyone there massacred, down to the last inhabitant. Gilbert, wishing to be avenged on Charles, caused the church at Combray to be burned down, the original church, that was, which Theodebert, when he and his court left the country residence he had here, at Tibercy, which is, of course, Theodebert to go out and fight the Burgundians, had promised to build over the tomb of Saint Hilaire if the saint brought him victory. Nothing remains of it now but the crypt into which Theodore has probably taken you, for Gilbert burned all the rest. Finally, he defeated the unlucky Charles with the aid of William the Conqueror, which the curé pronounced Willam, which is why so many English still come to visit this place. But he does not appear to have managed to win the affection of the people of Combray, for they fell upon him as he was coming out from Mass and cut off his head. Theodore has a little book that he lends people which tells you the whole story. But what is unquestionably the most remarkable thing about our church is the view from the steeple, which is full of grandeur. Certainly in your case, since you are not very strong, I would never recommend that you climb our 97 steps, just half the number they have in the famous cathedral at Milan. It is quite tiring enough for the most active person, especially as you have to go bent in two if you don't wish to crack your skull, and you collect all the cobwebs off the staircase on your clothes. In any case, you should be well wrapped up. He went on without noticing my aunt's fury at the mere suggestion that she could ever be capable of climbing his steeple. For there is a strong breeze there once you get to the top. Some people even assure me that they have felt the chill of death up there. No matter. On Sundays there are always clubs and societies who come, some of them long distances, to admire our beautiful panorama, and they always go home charmed. Wait now, next Sunday, if the weather holds, you will be sure to find a lot of people there for Rogation days. You must admit, certainly, that the view from up there is enchanting, with what you might call vistas along the plain, which have quite a special charm of their own. On a clear day you can see as far as Vouneuil. Above all, you can see at the same time places that you are in the habit of seeing one without the other, like the course of the Vivant and the ditches at Saint-Assy-les-Combray, which are separated, really, by a screen of tall trees. Or, to take another example, there are all the canals at Jouy-le-Vincon, which is Guaricus Vici Comitis, as of course you know. Each time that I have been to Jouy, I have seen a bit of a canal in one place, and then I have turned a corner and seen another, but when I saw the second I could no longer see the first. I tried in vain to imagine how they lay by one another. It was no good. But from the top of Saint-Hilaire, it's quite another matter. It's a whole circuit in which the locality is spread out before you, only you cannot make out the water. You would say that there were great rifts in the town, slicing it up in sections so that it looks like a brioche, whose pieces still hold together after it has been cut up. To get it all quite perfect, you would have to be in both places at once, on the top of Saint-Hilaire and down there at Jouy-le-Vincon. The curé had so much exhausted my aunt that no sooner had he gone than she was obliged to send away Eulalie also. "Here, my poor Eulalie," she said in a feeble voice, drawing a coin from a small purse that lay within her reach. "This is something so you won't forget me in your prayers." "Oh, but Madame Octave, I don't think I ought to. You know very well that I don't come here for that." So Eulalie would answer, with the same hesitation and the same embarrassment each time, as though it were the first, and with a look of displeasure that amused my aunt and never offended her. For if it so happened that Eulalie, when she took the money, looked a little less vexed than usual, my aunt would remark afterward, "I cannot think what has come over Eulalie. I gave her the same I usually give, and she did not look at all pleased." "I don't think she has very much to complain about, all the same," Françoise would sigh, for she had a tendency to regard as petty cash all that my aunt might give for herself or her children, and as treasure foolishly squandered on an ungrateful woman the little coins slipped every Sunday into Eulalie's hands, but so discreetly that Françoise never managed to see them. It was not that she wanted to have for herself the money that my aunt bestowed on Eulalie. She already enjoyed a sufficiency of all that my aunt possessed, in the knowledge that the wealth of the mistress automatically elevates and embellishes the maid in the eyes of the world, and that she herself was distinguished and worthy to be praised throughout Combray, Jouy-le-Vincon, and other places, on account of my aunt's many farms, her frequent and prolonged visits from the curé, the astonishing number of bottles of Vichy water that she consumed. And Françoise was avaricious only for my aunt. Had she had control over my aunt's fortune, which would have been her dream, she would have guarded it from the exploitation of others with a maternal ferocity. She would, however, have seen no great harm in what my aunt, whom she knew to be incurably generous, allowed herself to give away, had she given only to those who were already rich. Perhaps she felt that such persons, not in need of my aunt's presents, could not be suspected of liking her because of them. Besides, presents offered to persons of great wealth and position, such as Madame Césarat, and Monsieur Swann, Monsieur Legrandin, Madame Goupil, to persons of the same rank as my aunt, who would naturally mix with her, seemed to Françoise to be included among the customs of that strange and brilliant life led by rich people, who hunt, give balls, and pay visits, a life that she would contemplate with an admiring smile. But it was by no means the same thing if the beneficiaries of my aunt's generosity were of the class that Françoise would call people like myself, or people no better than myself, people whom she despised most, unless they addressed her as Madame Françoise, and considered themselves to be not as good. And when she saw that despite all her warnings, my aunt continued to do exactly as she pleased, and to waste money, or so at least Françoise believed, on undeserving creatures, she began to find that the presents she herself received from my aunt were very small compared to the imaginary riches squandered on Eulalie. There was not in the environs of Combray a farm of such prosperity and importance that Françoise doubted Eulalie's ability to buy it, without thinking twice, out of all that her visits to my aunt had brought her. It must be added that Eulalie had formed the same estimate of Françoise's vast and secret wealth. Usually, after Eulalie had gone, Françoise would mercilessly prophesy about her coming downfall. She hated Eulalie, but was at the same time afraid of her. So she felt bound when Eulalie was there to put on a good face. But she would make up for that after the other's departure, never, it is true, alluding to her by name, but hinting at her in Sibylline oracles or in utterances of a general character like those of Ecclesiastes, but so worded that their application could not escape my aunt. After peering out at the side of the curtain to see whether Eulalie had shut the front door behind her, "Flatterers know how to make themselves welcome and to gather up the crumbs, but have patience, the good Lord will punish them all one fine day," she would declaim, with the sidelong, insinuating glance of a Joaz, thinking of Athaliah alone when he says, "The prosperity of wicked men runs like a torrent past, and soon is spent." But when the curé had come as well, and by his interminable visit had drained my aunt's strength, Françoise followed Eulalie from the room, saying, "Madame Octave, I will leave you to rest. You look utterly tired out." And my aunt answered not a word, breathing a sigh so faint that it seemed it must prove her last, and lying there with closed eyes, as though already dead. But hardly had Françoise arrived downstairs, when 4 peals of a bell, pulled with the utmost violence, reverberated through the house, and my aunt, sitting erect on her bed, called out, "Has Eulalie gone yet? Would you believe it? I forgot to ask her whether Madame Goupil arrived in church before the elevation. Run after her, quick!" But Françoise returned alone, having failed to overtake Eulalie. "It is most provoking," said my aunt, shaking her head. "The one important thing I had to ask her." In this way, life went by for my Aunt Léonie, always the same, in the gentle uniformity of what she called, with a pretense of deprecation but with a deep tenderness, her little jog-trot, respected by all and sundry, not merely in her own house, where every one of us, having learned the futility of recommending any healthier mode of life, had become gradually resigned to its observance, but in the village as well, where 3 streets away a tradesman who had to hammer nails into a packing case would send first to Françoise to make sure that my aunt was not resting. Her little jog-trot was none the less disturbed on one occasion in this same year, like a fruit hidden that has grown and ripened unobserved until it falls spontaneously. One night the kitchen maid suddenly went into labor. But her pains were unbearable, and as there was no midwife in Combray, Françoise had to set off before dawn to fetch one from Tibessy. My aunt was unable to rest, owing to the cries of the girl. And as Françoise, though the distance was short, was very late in returning, her services were greatly missed. And so, in the course of the morning, my mother said to me, "Run upstairs and see if your aunt wants anything." I went into the first of her 2 rooms, and through the open door of the other, saw my aunt lying on her side, asleep. I could hear her snoring lightly. I was going to slip away when something, probably the sound of my entry, interrupted her sleep and made it change gears, as they say of automobiles nowadays. For the music of her snoring broke off for a second and began again on a lower note. Then she awoke and half turned her face, which I could see for the first time a kind of terror was imprinted on it. Clearly she had just had a terrifying dream. She could not see me from where she was lying, and I stood there not knowing whether I ought to go forward or to retire. But all at once she seemed to return to a sense of reality and to grasp the falsehood of the visions that had terrified her. A smile of joy, a pious act of thanksgiving to God, who grants that life shall be less cruel than our dreams, feebly illumined her face, and with the habit she had formed of speaking to herself half aloud when she thought herself alone, she murmured, "The Lord be praised. We have nothing to disturb us here but the kitchen maid giving birth. And I've been dreaming that my poor Octave had come back to life and was trying to make me walk every day." She stretched out a hand toward her rosary, which was lying on the small table, but sleep was once again overtaking her and did not leave her the strength to reach it. She fell asleep, calm and contented, and I crept out of the room on tiptoe, without either her or anyone else ever knowing what I had seen and heard. When I say that apart from such rare happenings as that confinement, my aunt's little jog-trot never underwent any variation, I do not include those variations which, repeated at regular intervals and in identical form, did no more really than print a sort of secondary pattern on the greater uniformity of her life. So, for instance, every Saturday, as Françoise had to go in the afternoon to market at Rouzanville-le-Pin, the whole household would have to have lunch an hour earlier. And my aunt had so thoroughly acquired the habit of this weekly exception to her general habits that she clung to it as much as to the rest. She was so well routined to it, as Françoise would say, that if on a Saturday she had to wait for her lunch until the regular hour, it would have upset her as much as if she had had, on an ordinary day, to put her lunch forward to its Saturday time. Incidentally, this acceleration of lunch gave Saturday for all of us an individual character, kindly and rather agreeable. At the moment when ordinarily there was still an hour to be lived through before the relaxation of mealtime, we would all know that in a few seconds we would see the endives make their precocious appearance, followed by the special favor of an omelette, an unmerited steak. The return of this asymmetrical Saturday was one of those pretty occurrences, intramural, localized, almost civic, which in uneventful lives and stable orders of society create a kind of national unity, and become the favorite theme for conversation, for pleasantries, for anecdotes that can be embroidered as the narrator pleases. It would have provided a nucleus ready-made for a legendary cycle if any of us had had the epic mind. At daybreak, before we were dressed, without rhyme or reason, save for the pleasure of proving the strength of our solidarity, we would call to one another good-humoredly, cordially, patriotically, "Hurry up, there's no time to lose, don't forget, it's Saturday," while my aunt, gossiping with Françoise and reflecting that the day would be even longer than usual, would say, "You might cook them a nice bit of veal, seeing that it's Saturday." If at 10:30 someone absent-mindedly pulled out a watch and said, "I say, an hour and a half still before lunch?" everyone else would be in ecstasies over being able to retort at once, "Why, what are you thinking? Have you forgotten that it's Saturday?" And a quarter of an hour later we would still be laughing and reminding ourselves to go up and tell Aunt Leonie about this memory lapse to amuse her. The very face of the sky appeared to undergo a change. After lunch, the sun, conscious that it was Saturday, would linger an hour longer, high in the sky, and when someone, thinking that we were late and starting for our walk, said, "What, only 2 o'clock? on feeling pass by him the heavy throb of the twin strokes from the steeple of Saint-Hilaire, which as a rule met no one at that hour on the roads, because of the midday meal or the nap that follows it, or on the banks of the bright and ever-flowing stream that even the angler had abandoned, so passed unaccompanied into the vacant sky, where only a few lazy clouds remained. The whole family would respond in chorus, "Why, you're forgetting we had lunch an hour earlier. You know very well it's Saturday." The surprise of a barbarian, for so we termed everyone who was not acquainted with Saturday's special customs, who had called at 11 o'clock to speak to my father and had found us at table, was an event that used to cause Françoise as much merriment as anything that ever happened in her life. And if she found it amusing that the dumbfounded visitor would not have known beforehand that we had our lunch an hour earlier on Saturday, it was still more irresistibly funny that my father himself, fully as she sympathized from the bottom of her heart with the rigid chauvinism that prompted him, would never have dreamed that the barbarian could fail to be aware of so simple a matter, and so had replied with no further enlightenment of the other's surprise at seeing us already in the dining-room, "You see, it's Saturday." On reaching this point in the story, Françoise would pause to wipe the tears of merriment from her eyes, and then, to add to her own enjoyment, would prolong the dialogue, inventing a further reply for the visitor to whom the word Saturday had conveyed nothing. And so, far from our objecting to these interpolations, we would feel that the story was not yet long enough, and would rally her with, "Oh, but surely he said something else as well. There was more than that the first time you told it." My great-aunt herself would lay aside her work and raise her head and look at us over her lorgnon. Saturday had yet another characteristic feature, namely, that during the month of May we used to go out on Saturday evenings after dinner to the month of Mary devotions. Since we sometimes met there Monsieur Van Tuylia, who held very strict views on the deplorable untidiness of young people, which seems to be encouraged these days, my mother would first see that there was nothing out of order in my appearance, and then we would set out for the church. It was in these month of May services that I can remember having first fallen in love with hawthorn blossoms. The hawthorns were not merely in the church, for there, holy ground as it was, we had all of us a right of entry, but arranged on the altar itself, inseparable from the mysteries in those celebrations they were playing a part, they thrust in among the tapers and the sacred vessels their rows of branches, tied to one another horizontally in a festive preparation. And they were made more lovely still by the festoons of their leaves, over which were scattered in profusion, as over a bridal train, little clusters of buds of a dazzling whiteness. Though I dared not look at them except furtively, I could feel that the ceremonious preparations were composed of living things, and that it was of Nature herself who, by trimming the shape of the foliage and by adding the crowning ornament of those white buds, had made the decorations worthy of what was at once a public rejoicing and a solemn mystery. Higher up on the altar, their corollas had opened here and there with a careless grace, holding so unconcernedly, like a final, almost vaporous adornment, their bunches of stamens, slender as gossamer, which clouded the flowers themselves in a white mist, that in following these with my eyes, and trying to imitate somewhere inside myself the action of their blossoming, I imagined it as a swift and thoughtless movement of the head, with an enticing glance from her contracted pupils, by a young girl in white, carefree and vivacious. Monsieur Van Tuylia had come in with his daughter and had sat down beside us. He belonged to a good family and had once been piano teacher to my grandmother's sisters, so that when, after losing his wife and inheriting some property, he had retired to the neighborhood of Combray, we used often to invite him to our house, but with his intense prudishness he had given up coming, so as not to be obliged to meet Swann, who had made what he called a most unsuitable marriage, as seems to be the fashion these days. My mother, on hearing that he composed, told him by way of a compliment that when she came to see him he must play her something of his own. Monsieur Ventille would have liked nothing better, but he always carried politeness and consideration for others to so fine a point, always putting himself in their place, that he was afraid of boring them or of appearing egotistical if he carried out or even allowed them to suspect what were his own desires. On the day when my parents had gone to pay him a visit, I had accompanied them, but they had allowed me to remain outside, and as Monsieur Ventille's house stood on a site beneath a hillock, covered with shrubs, among which I took cover, I had found myself on a level with his drawing-room upstairs, and only a few feet away from its window. When a servant came in to tell him that my parents had arrived, I had seen Monsieur Ventille run to the piano and lay out a sheet of music so as to catch the eye. But as soon as they entered the room, he had snatched it away and hidden it in a corner. He was afraid, no doubt, of letting them suppose that he was glad to see them only because it gave him a chance of playing them some of his compositions. And every time that my mother, in the course of her visit, had returned to the subject of his playing, he had hurriedly protested, I cannot think who put that on the piano. It's not the proper place for it at all." And it turned the conversation aside to other topics, precisely because those were of less interest to himself. His one and only passion was for his daughter, and she, with her somewhat boyish appearance, looked so robust that it was hard to restrain a smile when one saw the precautions her father used to take for her health, with spare shawls always in readiness to wrap around her shoulders. My grandmother had drawn our attention to the gentle, delicate, almost timid expression that might often be caught flitting across the face, dotted all over with freckles, of this otherwise ungracious child. When she had spoken, she would at once take her words in the sense in which her audience must have heard them. She would be alarmed at the possibility of a misunderstanding, and one would see, in clear outline, as though in a transparency beneath the mannish face of the good sort that she was, the finer features of a young woman in tears. When before turning to leave the church I knelt before the altar, I felt suddenly as I rose again a bittersweet fragrance of almonds steal toward me from the hawthorns. I then noticed that on the flowers themselves were little spots of a creamier colour, in which I imagined that this fragrance must lie concealed, as the taste of a frangipane lay in the burned parts, or the taste of Mademoiselle Ventille's cheeks beneath her freckles. Despite the motionless silence of the hawthorns, this intermittent scent was like the murmur of their intense life, with which the whole altar was quivering like a country hedge visited by living antennae, of which I was reminded by seeing certain stamens, almost reddish-brown, that seemed to have kept the springtime virulence, the irritant power of stinging insects, now metamorphosed into flowers. On leaving the church, we would talk for a moment with Monsieur Ventille in front of the porch. Boys would be bickering loudly in the square, and he would interfere, taking the side of the little ones and lecturing the big. If his daughter said in her loud voice how glad she had been to see us, immediately it would seem as though some older and more sensitive a sister latent in her had blushed at this thoughtless, schoolboyish utterance, which had perhaps made us think that she was angling for an invitation to the house. Her father would then arrange a cloak over her shoulders. They would clamber into a little buggy that she herself drove, and home they would both go. As for ourselves, the next day being Sunday, with no need to be up and stirring before high mass, if it was a moonlit night and the air was warm, then instead of taking us home at once, my father, in his thirst for glory, would lead us on a long walk around by the Calvary, which my mother's utter incapacity for taking her bearings or even knowing which road she might be on made her regard as a triumph of his strategic genius. Sometimes we would go as far as the viaduct, which began to stride on its long legs of stone at the railway station, and to me typified all the wretchedness of exile beyond the last outposts of civilization, because every year, as we came down from Paris, we would be warned to take special care when we got to Combray not to miss the station, to be ready before the train stopped, since it would start again in 2 minutes and proceed across the viaduct out of the lands of Christendom, of which Combray to me represented the farthest limit. We would return by the Boulevard de la Guerre, which contained the most attractive villas in the town. In each of their gardens the moonlight, copying the art of Hubert Robert, had scattered its broken staircases of white marble, its fountains of water, its gates ajar. Its beams had obliterated the telegraph office. All that was left of it was a column half shattered, but preserving the beauty of a ruin that endures for all time. I would by now be dragging my weary limbs, and ready to drop with sleep. The balmy scent of the linden trees seemed a consolation that I could obtain only at the price of a great exhaustion, and not worthy of the effort. From gates far apart, the watchdogs, awakened by our steps in the silence, would set up an antiphonal barking, as I still hear them bark at times in the evenings, and it is in their custody, when the public gardens of Combray were constructed on its site, that the Boulevard de la Guerre must have taken refuge, for wherever I may be, as soon as they begin their alternate challenge and response, I can see it again, with its linden trees and its pavement glistening beneath the moon. Suddenly my father would bring us to a standstill and ask my mother, "Where are we?" Utterly worn out by the walk, but still proud of him, she would lovingly confess that she had not the least idea. He would shrug his shoulders and laugh, and then, as though it had slipped with his latchkey from his jacket pocket, he would point out to us, right in front of us, the back gate of our own garden, which had come with the familiar corner of the Rue d'Esprit, to await us at the end of our wanderings over paths unknown. My mother would murmur admiringly, "You really are extraordinary." And from that instant, I had not to take another step. The ground moved forward under my feet in that garden, where for so long my actions had ceased to require any attention from my will. Habit had taken me in her arms and carried me all the way up to my bed, like a little child. Although Saturday, by beginning an hour earlier and by depriving her of the services of Françoise, passed more slowly than other days for my aunt, yet the moment it was past and a new week begun, she would look forward with impatience to its return, as something that embodied all the novelty and distraction that her frail and maniacal body was still able to endure. This was not to say, however, that she did not at times long for some even greater variation, that she did not pass through those exceptional hours in which one thirsts for something different from what one has. When people who, through lack of energy or imagination, are unable to generate any restorative principle in themselves, cry out as the clock strikes or the postman rings to bring them something new, even if it be the worst, an emotion, a sorrow. When the heart, which happiness has silenced, like an idle harp, longs to vibrate under a hand, even though the hand be brutal and the heart broken. When the will, which has with such difficulty acquired the right to abandon itself freely to its own desires, its own sufferings, would like to cast its guiding reins into the hands of overpowering events, even though they be cruel. Of course, since my aunt's strength, which was completely drained by the slightest exertion, returned only drop by drop into the pool of her repose, the reservoir was very slow in filling, and months would go by before she reached that slight overflow which others use up in their daily activities, but which she was incapable of knowing or deciding how to use. I have no doubt then that just as the desire to have her potatoes served with bechamel sauce for a change would be formed ultimately from the pleasure she found in the daily reappearance of those mashed potatoes of which she never tired, she would extract from the accumulation of those monotonous days on which she so much depended, a keen expectation of some domestic cataclysm, to last only a moment, but violent enough to force her to put into effect once and for all one of those changes that she knew would be beneficial to her health. But she could never initiate it without some such stimulus. She truly loved us. She would have enjoyed mourning us, coming at a moment when she felt well and was not perspiring. The news that the house was being destroyed by fire, in which all the rest of us had already perished, a fire which, in a little while, would not leave one stone standing on another, but from which she herself would have plenty of time to escape without undue haste, provided that she rose at once from her bed, must have haunted her dreams as a prospect that combined with the two secondary advantages of letting her taste the full savour of her affection for us in a long period of mourning, and of causing universal stupefaction in the village when she would lead the funeral procession, crushed but courageous, moribund but erect, with the much precious advantage of forcing her at the right moment, with no time to lose, no possibility of enervating hesitations, to go off and spend the summer at her charming farm, where there was a waterfall. Inasmuch as nothing of this sort had ever occurred, though indeed she must often have pondered the success of such a maneuver as she lay alone absorbed in her interminable games of solitaire, and though it must have plunged her in despair from the first moment of its realization, from the first of those little unforeseen facts, from the first word announcing bad news, whose accent can never be forgotten, from everything that bears on it the imprint of actual death, so terribly different from its logical and abstract possibility, she would fall back from time to time to make her life more interesting by introducing other imaginary dramas that she would follow with passion. She would beguile herself with a sudden suspicion that Françoise had been robbing her, that she had set a trap to make certain and had caught her betrayer red-handed, and being in the habit, when she had made up a game of cards by herself, of playing both her own and her adversary's hands, she would first murmur to herself Françoise's awkward apologies, and then reply to them with such a fiery indignation that any of us who happened to intrude upon her at one of these moments would find her bathed in perspiration, her eyes blazing, her false hair pushed awry and exposing the baldness of her brow. Françoise must often, from time to time, in the next room, heard these mordant sarcasms levelled at herself, and whose invention would not have relieved my aunt's feelings sufficiently had they remained in a purely immaterial form, without the degree of reality that she added to them by murmuring them half aloud. Sometimes, however, even these counterpane dramas would not satisfy my aunt. She must see her plays performed. And so, on a Sunday, with all the doors mysteriously closed, she would confide in Eulalie her doubts of Françoise's integrity and her determination to be rid of her. And on another day, she would confide in Françoise her suspicions of the disloyalty of Eulalie, to whom the front door would soon be closed for good. A few days later, and disgusted with her confidant of the evening before, she would again be as thick as thieves with the traitor, while before the next performance the two would once more have changed their parts. But the suspicions that Eulalie might occasionally breed in her were no more than a flash in the pan that must soon subside for lack of fuel, since Eulalie was not living with her in the house. It was a very different matter when the suspect was Françoise, of whose presence under the same roof as herself my aunt was perpetually conscious. Though for fear of catching cold, if she were to leave her bed, she would never dare go downstairs to the kitchen to see for herself whether her suspicions were well founded. And so on, by degrees, until her mind had no other occupation than to attempt at every moment of the day to discover what Françoise could be doing and trying to conceal from her. She would notice the most furtive movements of Françoise's features, something contradictory in what she was saying, some desire that she seemed to be hiding, and she would show her that she was unmasked by a single word which made Françoise turn pale, and which my aunt seemed to find a cruel satisfaction in driving into her unhappy servant's heart. And the very next Sunday, a disclosure by Eulalie, like one of those discoveries that suddenly open up in an unsuspected field for exploration, to some new science that has hitherto followed only the beaten paths, proved to my aunt that her own worst suspicions were far short of the truth. "But Francoise ought to know that," said Eulalie, "now that you have given her a carriage." "Now that I've given her a carriage?" gasped my aunt. "Oh, but I didn't know." "I only thought so. I saw her go by yesterday in her open carriage, as proud as an Arabian, on her way to Rouzonville market. I suppose it must be Madame Octave who had given it to her." And so on, by degrees, until Francoise and my aunt, the quarry and the hunter, could never cease from trying to anticipate each other's ruses. My mother was afraid that Francoise might develop a genuine hatred of my aunt, who was doing everything in her power to severely offend her. However that might be, Francoise had come more and more to pay extraordinary attention to my aunt's least word and gesture. When she had to ask her for anything, she would hesitate for a long time, making up her mind how best to begin. And when she had uttered her request, she would watch my aunt covertly, trying to guess from the expression on her face what she thought of it and how she would reply. And in this way, whereas the artist who had been reading memoirs of the 17th century and wanted to bring himself nearer to the great king, would believe that he was on the right path by fabricating a genealogy that traced his own descent from some historical family, or when he engaged in correspondence with one of the reigning sovereigns of Europe, and so would shut his eyes to the mistake he was making in seeking to establish similarities by identical and therefore lifeless copies. An elderly lady in a small country town, by doing no more than yield wholehearted obedience to her own irresistible eccentricities and to a spirit of mischief engendered by idleness, could see, without ever having given a thought to Louis XIV, the most trivial occupations of her daily life, her morning toilette, her lunch, her afternoon nap, assume, by virtue of their despotic singularity, something of the interest found in what St. Simon used to call the machinery of life at Versailles, and she was able, too, to persuade herself that her silence, a shade of good humour or of arrogance on her features, were for Francoise the matter for commentary as tense with passion and terror as were the silence, the good humour, or the arrogance of the king, when a courtier, or even his greatest nobles, had presented a petition to him at the bend of an avenue at Versailles. One Sunday, when my aunt had received simultaneous visits from the curé and from Eulalie, and had been left alone afterward to rest, the whole family went upstairs to bid her good night, and Mamma offered her condolences for the unlucky coincidence that always brought both visitors to her door at the same time. "I hear that things went wrong again today, Leonie," she said kindly. "You have all your friends here at once." And my great-aunt interrupted with, "Too many good things." For since her daughter's illness, she believed that she could cheer her by always drawing her attention to the brighter side of things. But my father had begun to speak. "I would like to take advantage," he said, "of the whole family's being here to tell you a story, so as not to have to begin all over again to each of you separately. I am afraid we are on bad terms with Monsieur Legrandin. He barely said hello to me this morning." I did not wait to hear the end of my father's story, for I had been with him myself after Mass when we had passed Monsieur Legrandin's. Instead, I went downstairs to the kitchen to inquire about the menu for dinner, which was of fresh interest to me daily, like the news one reads in a newspaper, and excited me as might the programme of a coming festivity. As Monsieur Legrandin had passed close by us on our way from church, walking by the side of the chatelaine from nearby, whom we knew only by sight, my father had greeted him, without our stopping, in a manner at once friendly and reserved. Monsieur Legrandin had barely replied, with an air of surprise, as though he had not recognized us, and with that distant look characteristic of people who do not wish to be agreeable, and who, from the sudden receding depths of their eyes, seem to have caught sight of you at the far end of an interminably straight road, and at so great a distance that they content themselves with directing you toward an almost imperceptible movement of the head, in proportion to your puppet-like dimensions. Now, the lady who was walking with Monsieur Legrandin was a model of virtue and highly esteemed. There could be no question of his having an affair and being embarrassed at being found out. And my father asked him how he could possibly have asked himself how he could possibly have displeased Legrandin. "I would be all the more sorry to feel that he is angry with us," my father said, "because among all the people in their Sunday clothes there is something about him, with his little cutaway coat and his soft necktie, so little pretentious, so genuinely simple, an air of innocence almost, which is really attractive." But the family council was unanimous in its opinion that my father had imagined the whole thing, or that Legrandin, at the moment in question, had been preoccupied in thinking about something else. Anyhow, my father's fears were dissipated no later than the following evening, as we returned from a long walk. We saw near Pont-Vu Legrandin himself, who, on account of the holidays, was spending a few days more in Combray. He came up to us with an outstretched hand. "Do you know, Master Book-Lover," he asked me, "this line of Paul Desjardins? 'Now all the woods are black, but still the sky is blue.' Is that not a fine rendering of a moment like this? Perhaps you have never read Paul Desjardins. Read him, my boy, read him. In these days he is converted, they tell me, into a preaching friar, but he used to have the most charming watercolor touch. Now all the woods are black, oh black, but still the sky is blue. May you always see a blue sky overhead, my young friend. And then, even when the time comes, which is coming now for me, when the woods are already black, when night is fast falling, you will be able to console yourself, as I am doing, by looking up to the sky." He took a cigarette from his pocket and stood for a long time, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Goodbye, friends," he suddenly exclaimed, and left us.